You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. In 2015, police in New York were alerted to a very strange death. The victim, who was a pillar of their community, had died suddenly and unexpectedly, and their autopsy had revealed something very unusual. So the police began digging into the case, and eventually, after a few major twists and turns, they would get to the shocking truth. And the truth could be summed up in one word: evil. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the 5-star review button out for dinner for their birthday, but have the waitstaff sing happy birthday to you. Also, it was late afternoon on Saturday, July 18th, 2015, and Mary Yoder was out in her garden doing some weeding and replanting. It had rained early that morning, but now the sky over the little town of Whitesboro, located in the rural center of New York State, had the perfect amount of cloud cover, just enough to take the edge off the summer sun and heat. Mary smiled as she sat back on her heels and hooked her shoulder-length blonde hair behind her ears. Mary had just turned 60 4 months ago, but with her strong arms and slim, athletic build, she looked and felt much younger. Not that age, at least as a number, was anything that Mary spent a lot of time thinking about. What interested her much more was healthy living and enjoying all the experiences and wisdom she had gained over the years. And at 60, she'd had enough time to develop a true passion for most of her hobbies. These included making beautiful hand-thrown pottery, trying out all forms of exercise, making sure she and her family ate well, and, most recently, learning how to belly dance. But in the spring and summer, it was her prized garden that Mary loved the most. And every minute she spent out there among the flowers and vegetables, enjoying the natural beauty of her quiet surroundings, just added to her feelings of contentment and gratitude. Mary turned away from her garden and looked up from under the brim of her old baseball cap at her comfortable 4-bedroom house that she shared with her husband, Bill. Not only had the two of them been married for almost 40 years, they were also business partners and chiropractors, healthcare professionals who treated pain related to nerve and skeletal disorders by manipulating a person's body. It was a method that some of their patients referred to jokingly as, quote, getting their backs cracked. Mary and Bill had established their practice, Family Chiropractic Care, back in 1987, just 2 years after they both had graduated from Life University in Georgia with their Doctor of Chiropractic degrees. It had felt good to come back to New York. Mary had been born there, and it was where she had originally met Bill back in 1977 when they were both attending undergrad at the University of Buffalo. 28 years after setting up their private practice, Mary and Bill both still loved Whitesboro, which was nestled right between the Adirondack and Catskill Mountains in a beautiful valley of land that bordered the Mohawk River. With under 4,000 residents, Whitesboro was more like a rural village than it was a big bustling town. Many of the homes, the Yoders included, were spread out and surrounded by huge lawns and fields. Even so, the people there knew each other, and everybody seemed to know Mary. Whether she was treating patients at Family Chiropractic, located just 15 minutes away from her home, or riding her bike, working in her garden, or shopping at the local health food store and farmer's market, Mary just gave off this aura of warmth and kindness that instantly drew people to her. And when Mary smiled and spoke to you, no matter how short the conversation was, you felt like you had all of her attention and energy. But Mary and Bill's quiet, predictable, nice little life in Whitesboro was about to change. In a couple of months, on September 5th, the couple was going on the longest vacation of their married lives, a month-long cruise and European tour that they had spent all of June planning together. And even though Mary and Bill hadn't said it to each other in so many words, they both knew that this long absence from work was another step towards their full-blown retirement. Bill was almost 70 years old, and starting a few months ago, the two of them had begun scaling back their work hours. Bill now worked only 2 half-days a week at the office, while Mary worked 2 full days. And instead of being open Monday through Friday, 8:30 a.m. to 5 p.m., the office was now closed on Tuesdays and Thursdays. But as Mary turned back around and knelt down beside her garden again, She secretly thought to herself that she was probably slightly less interested in retirement now than Bill was. Being 10 years younger than him, she felt like she still had quite a bit of energy left. But as she thought about this, she also remembered that even when they chose to retire, even if it was tomorrow, they wouldn't get to actually retire right away. They would need to stay on for quite a while to train the next person who was going to come in and take over their practice. So it wasn't like this retirement was going to be an immediate shift. Plus, she could keep doing her outreach work as long as she wanted to, maybe even beyond their retirement, since it didn't really involve Bill. Mary's outreach work were her regular visits to nearby Amish settlements to provide chiropractic care for them. The Amish are part of a conservative religious sect that relies on farming to support and feed themselves. The Amish are known to live a very simple life with almost no modern technology, and so a lifestyle that relies so much on physical labor often leads to aches and pains, and so the non-medical treatments that Mary could offer them were met with gratitude, along with gifts of homemade pies and jams that Mary often counted as partial payment for her services. And while this willingness to work for food endeared Mary to the Amish, that kind of bookkeeping had not exactly made her and her husband rich. But once she and Bill actually sold their practice, they would finally have both the money and the time to travel, relax, pursue their own individual interests, and spend more time with their 3 adult children and their 4 wonderful grandchildren. As Mary finally stood up from her garden and stripped off her battered and dirty work gloves, she turned and looked again at the family home. And suddenly she found herself thinking of Adam. Adam had been the last of the Yoder kids to finally move out of the house. Thinking about her 24-year-old son, the baby of the family and younger than his sisters by more than 10 years, made Mary worry. Ever since graduating from high school, Adam had stumbled in life a lot more than his 2 older sisters had. He also struggled with bouts of depression and anxiety. Even now that Adam was out of the house and living on his own, it was obvious to Mary and Bill that he didn't really know what he wanted to do with his life quite yet. He was enrolled in college, but previously, when he had been in college, he had dropped out. In fact, Adam had enrolled and dropped out of college on more than one occasion. But for now anyways, he was in school, and so Mary and Bill were hopeful that he would just continue and he would graduate, and then he would fall into a career that he hopefully enjoyed. But the idea of Adam working a serious job long-term truthfully didn't really compute. The only steady job Adam had ever held was his part and full-time jobs as office manager and receptionist at the family chiropractic offices. But Mary was hopeful for her son. He might be struggling now, but he was a wonderful young man with good intentions. For example, even though he no longer worked at the family chiropractic office because he was now focusing on school, he still made regular visits there just so he could say hello to his parents and give his mom a quick hug. He also made sure, before he stopped working at the office to focus on school, that he found his parents a replacement to work in the office. And the person he recruited was his lovely longtime girlfriend, Katie Conley. Mary and Bill initially had some reservations about this. Not about Katie, she was lovely, but about the fact that if they hired her and then she and Adam broke up, what would Katie do? Would she quit? Would she stay on? And if so, wouldn't that be really uncomfortable? And considering that Adam and Katie were one of those couples that were always on again, off again, this seemed like a pretty valid concern. But ultimately, Mary and Bill hired Katie, and pretty much right away, they knew it had been the right choice. Katie had that office humming so smoothly now that Mary couldn't even imagine the practice operating without her. Mary flexed her back and then looked up at the mountains off in the distance. Then, as she tried to push her concern for Adam out of her mind, she began walking toward the back door of the house. When she reached it, she opened it up and stepped inside, and instantly she heard Bill in the kitchen already getting a start on making dinner for the 2 of them. Before closing the door behind her, Mary took one last look back at her prized garden. The last of the clouds had cleared away, and so everything sparkled in the early evening sunlight. It was at moments like this, Mary thought, that life really did seem almost too good to be true. 2 days later, on Monday, July 20th, 2015, Mary and Bill both woke at their usual time, around 6:30 a.m. After chatting for a few minutes and making the bed together, Bill headed into their exercise room to do a short workout before he made himself breakfast and got a start on the day's activities. It was his day off, and he planned to do a little reading and tackle a few household projects on a to-do list that never seemed to actually get any shorter. As he started his exercise routine, he could hear his wife's footsteps hurrying from room to room as she got ready for a long day at work. Mary always moved at top speed, and after 37 years of marriage, Bill knew that what his wife appreciated more than anything on a Monday morning was for him to stay out of her way. And since Mary had never been much of a morning eater, Bill also knew better than to offer to make her breakfast. When they kissed each other goodbye at 7:45 a.m. that morning, Bill was struck, as usual, by his wife's vitality and her warmth. It was Monday, the start of a busy day, and Mary practically glowed with good health and energy. A minute later, she had left the house and hopped into her car. She gave Bill one more wave before backing out onto King Road and heading west toward the offices of Family Chiropractic Care. 15 minutes later, Mary had arrived at the plain white medical building with its flat roof and box-like exterior. After pulling her car into the parking space right next to Katie's, Mary hopped out, and just a minute later, she was walking through the door of the front office. Katie looked up from her computer screen, and the two women exchanged quick smiles, and Katie held up a list of that day's appointments. This was Katie's way of telling her boss that no one had canceled, and they had a full slate of patients. And sure enough, minutes after Mary's arrival, Family Chiropractic Care was buzzing with activity and people. There were the usual packages and deliveries, along with back-to-back appointments, but that was just part of it. Mary was as much a friend as she was a doctor, and so it wasn't unusual for clients to drop by in person to schedule their appointments or just to say hello. And it wasn't just the front office that was busy. Mary also ran a side business out of the back office where she sold a line of organic nutritional supplements that included her favorite, the protein powder that she herself often mixed with almond milk and used as a meal substitute or pick-me-up. By the time 12:30 in the afternoon rolled around, Mary was ready for a break. Although it would have to be a very short break, since Mary also planned to use the lunch hour to go visit her 92-year-old mother who lived in nearby Utica. Telling Katie she'd be back by 1:30 p.m., Mary ducked into the back room where she used the office blender to mix up a quick protein shake for her lunch before making the 10-minute drive to her mother's house. About an hour later, just minutes before 1:30 p.m., Mary and Katie were both back in the office and opening the door to the first patient of the afternoon. As always, it was like turning on a faucet. Almost immediately, the office was alive with the sound of voices and the gentle clink of the doors opening and closing. It wasn't until Mary's 2:30 appointment that she started to notice something was wrong. She had just said hello to her patient, a woman named Elizabeth Kelly, who had been coming to Mary and Bill for 17 years, when Mary suddenly had to excuse herself to run to the bathroom. Aside from the occasional cold, Mary hardly ever got sick, and yet here she was, her hands gripping either side of the toilet, throwing up into the toilet bowl. As soon as her stomach had calmed down, Mary stood up, she cleaned the toilet thoroughly before scrubbing her hands in hot soapy water and then rinsing her face. When she got back out to the exam room, her patient looked concerned and asked Mary if she was feeling okay. It was just very unusual for Mary to look so uncomfortable and distracted. But Mary smiled at Elizabeth and gently shook her head and said it was nothing that a hot cup of ginger or peppermint tea couldn't cure. But by late afternoon, Mary was feeling even worse, and just the thought of herbal tea, even one that was supposed to soothe digestive disorders, was enough to send Mary right back into the bathroom. By 4:30 p.m., it was obvious to Katie that her boss was not feeling well because she was watching Mary make constant trips to the bathroom. But the 22-year-old office manager didn't want to embarrass Mary, so she kept her mouth shut. When 5:30 p.m. rolled around and it was time for Katie to leave for the day, Mary was still finishing up with her last patients. Before turning off her computer, Katie stood up and peeked her head into the exam room where Mary was working. In her quiet and now very concerned voice, Katie asked if Mary needed anything or maybe wanted Katie to stay until Mary was finished. But Mary shook her head no. She thanked Katie for the offer and told Katie to just be sure to lock the door and flip the open sign to closed when Katie left. At 6:45 p.m., Mary was finally finished with her workday. When she called her husband Bill to tell him she was heading home, she also told him that she must have picked up some sort of gastrointestinal virus and couldn't keep anything down, so don't worry about making any dinner for her. When Mary arrived home 15 minutes later, she barely paused long enough to shut the car door behind her before rushing into the house and heading straight for the bathroom. By bedtime, Mary was too uncomfortable with diarrhea, vomiting, and abdominal pains to sleep upstairs with Bill. Instead, she told her husband she'd rather just rest downstairs on the couch close to the downstairs bathroom. She told Bill not to worry and that she was sure she'd be feeling better by tomorrow. But when Bill came downstairs the next morning, Mary looked even worse. She was so pale and sweaty and disheveled that right then and there, Bill grabbed the telephone and he called their oldest daughter, Liana, a medical doctor who lived 6 hours away in Long Island, New York. When Bill described the situation to Liana, she told her father to get Mary to the hospital emergency room as soon as possible. At first, Mary wanted to wait long enough to take a bath and clean up, but even as Bill started filling the tub, Mary changed her mind. Almost too weak to stand up from the couch, she told her husband they needed to leave right now. By late afternoon, after Mary had been admitted to the hospital and doctors had begun aggressively treating her for what appeared to be a vicious stomach bug, Mary started to feel better. At about 6 p.m., Mary was finally all washed and clean, she was reasonably comfortable, and she was fully rehydrated. Also by 6 p.m., the doctors had looked over Mary's various scans of her bones and organs, and there were no signs of trauma or disease. Additionally, her blood work had come back and it was all normal. So even though they didn't know for sure, the doctors were reasonably confident that it really had just been a bad stomach bug. But because Mary's symptoms had been so severe, doctors wanted to keep her overnight, just to make sure that she really was on the mend before letting her go back home. At 9 p.m., Mary smiled at Bill, who had been sitting by her side the whole time, and told him to go back home and get some sleep. If there was any change in her condition, she or the nursing staff would give him a call. Bill thanked Mary and then gave her a kiss, and then he walked out of her room and made his way toward the front doors of the hospital. Within the hour, he was back at the Yoder house in his pajamas, brushing his teeth. When he was done, he turned his cell phone off and plugged it into a charging station in one of their empty bedrooms upstairs. Then he made his way across the hall to his own bedroom and climbed into the bed. By 10 p.m., he was fast asleep. It wasn't until the next morning at 5 a.m., when Bill heard a ferocious pounding on the front door, that he realized something must be terribly wrong. When he pulled on his bathrobe and stumbled downstairs to open the door, he saw 2 state troopers waiting for him in their gray uniforms and broad-brimmed Stetson hats. They told Bill he had to get to the hospital right away. Mary had been moved overnight from an observation room to the intensive care unit. While Bill had slept peacefully, Mary's doctors had called Bill's cell phone and their landline again and again, trying to alert him to the fact that Mary was now gravely ill and fighting for her life, but Bill had not answered. The state police escort took Bill right into the parking lot of the hospital where Mary was staying. By 5:45 a.m., Bill was sitting in the ICU waiting area, calling each of his children to tell them it was time for all of them to get to the hospital as fast as they could. Then he made the same call to Mary's 5 sisters, 2 brothers, and her 92-year-old mother. And then finally, Bill was allowed into Mary's hospital room, and what he saw shocked him. Mary, her blue eyes full of pain and terror as she looked desperately into her husband's face, was now on life support. The only reason she was still alive was because doctors had been using electrical shocks to restart her heart each time it started to fail. Surrounded by her family, Mary held her husband's hand and closed her eyes. By 2:54 that afternoon of July 22, 2015, Mary Yoder, one of the healthiest people her family had ever known, was dead. Her heart had simply stopped beating. Immediately after Mary's death, the Yoder family requested an autopsy to find out how a gastrointestinal virus or infection could have killed an otherwise exceptionally healthy 60-year-old woman. That autopsy would be performed the very next day on the morning of July 23rd, but instead of getting any answers, the initial autopsy results were inconclusive, So even after releasing Mary's body for cremation, the medical examiner's office continued to run tests on the blood and tissue samples they had collected from Mary's body. 2 days after the autopsy, on July 25th, Bill and his children invited family members and friends to join them in front of Mary's beloved gardens for a celebration of her life. It was Mary's favorite time of the year, and all of her flowers were in full bloom. Afterward, Mary and Bill's daughter, Liana, did her best to pull the shattered Yoder family back together. Liana was most like Mary in terms of temperament and her practical hands-on approach to life and fixing problems. She encouraged her father to get in touch with their Aunt Kathleen, Mary's older sister, who had also recently lost her spouse of many years. And Liana also encouraged her father and her brother, Adam, to go take a trip together to the West Coast just a couple of weeks so they could rest and hopefully begin to heal. But the first order of business, as far as Liana was concerned, was just to get her father and siblings out of Whitesboro. The calls and visits and gifts of food from friends and patients were well meant, but especially for Bill and for Katie, who had spent hours and even days at the office on the phone canceling appointments, it was just overwhelming. So Liana invited everyone to come back to her home in Long Island for a little getaway and a much-needed change of scenery. The effort involved in doing anything seemed almost too much for Bill, but eventually he agreed. And even though Katie and Adam seemed to be in one of their relationship off cycles, Adam urged Katie to join them in Long Island too. In the weeks that followed, the Yoder family began the long process of healing. After the initial shock and disbelief over their mother's sudden and unexpected death, they had begun to accept the idea that Mary had just died of complications from a gastrointestinal infection, and they thought less and less about what the full autopsy report, which had not been released yet, might actually tell them. So, when Bill got a call on September 17th, 2015, almost 3 months after Mary's death, he was totally unprepared for what the doctors had to tell him. According to the full autopsy, Mary Yoder had not died of a gastrointestinal virus or infection. In fact, Mary Yoder had not died of any natural causes. Mary Yoder had been poisoned with a toxin called colchicine, the same drug found in a common prescription medication that is used to treat a painful form of arthritis called gout. In tiny and controlled amounts, colchicine helps reduce inflammation that causes pain. But in the lethal amount found in Mary's organs and blood, colchicine causes such profound damage to cells that the body's response is literally to order those cells to die. At first, Bill and his children were just as confused as they were alarmed by this revelation. The doctors had avoided using words like foul play or homicide. Instead, they told the family that the medical examiner's office was still evaluating the test results and considering its next steps. But less than 1 month later, on October 15th, when still no more word had come from Mary's autopsy, and so the family was left to just speculate on what might have happened to Mary, Mary's younger sister, Sharon Mills, who was convinced this was no accident, decided to just call the Oneida County Sheriff's Department and tell them as much. Oneida County was the department that served Whitesboro. And by the time Detective Van Namey had finally gotten off the phone with Sharon, he found himself agreeing that Mary's death did seem very suspicious. And so after Detective Van Namey spoke to his superiors, and they went over the autopsy report themselves, the Oneida County Sheriff's Office decided to open an investigation into Mary's death. Right from the start, Detective Van Namey knew he faced two huge challenges. Mary had died almost 3 months earlier, and if she had in fact been murdered, the trail was already going cold. He also knew from discussions with the medical examiner's office that it would be very hard to track down the source of the colchicine that had killed Mary, as doctors, either Mary or Bill, could have ordered colchicine, and since the drug also occurs naturally in some plants, investigators would have to check into Mary's gardening habits and what pesticides or chemicals she had been exposed to. And once Detective Van Namey found out that Mary was a heavy user of nutritional supplements, he knew it was possible that the poison could have been in one of her supplements. And so knowing he was getting a very late start and had some serious challenges ahead, the detective did not waste any time. He immediately requested access to Bill and Mary Yoder's phone records, and although Mary did not have a life insurance policy, so no one close to her stood to get a payout if she died, the detective still started to take a closer look at the Yoder's finances. Detective Van Namey ordered deputies to conduct interviews with family and friends to find out more about Mary's private life. He asked Katie Conley to come down to the station and give a statement about Mary's last day at work on July 20th, and he talked to the patients who had seen Mary that morning and afternoon. He arranged to have the supplements in Mary's back office at Family Chiropractic tested for the presence of colchicine, and when it came to people of interest, Detective Van Namey already had one name at the top of his suspect list. In a town as small as Whitesboro, people were bound to talk, and if some of the rumors investigators had heard were true, it sounded like maybe Mary's perfect marriage wasn't so perfect after all. It would turn out that within 2 weeks of Mary's death, Bill had indeed connected with Aunt Kathleen, like his daughter Liana had suggested he do. Kathleen had recently lost her husband of many years, and she lived near the Yoder household, and so Liana figured she would be a good person to speak to as Bill went through his own grieving process. But apparently, Bill and Kathleen had begun doing more than just chit-chatting. By mid-September, just 2 months after Mary's death, Bill had become sexually and romantically involved with his sister-in-law. That relationship between Bill and Kathleen had caused a lot of tension among Mary's other siblings. One of Mary's sisters suggested that Bill was after Mary's money, and that in the weeks just before she died, Mary had placed a call to a marriage counselor, presumably to discuss problems in her marriage. And one of Kathleen's neighbors reported seeing Bill and Kathleen sharing a passionate embrace before Mary's death, suggesting that maybe Bill was having an affair while Mary was still alive. And while all of that was still unproven speculation, detectives did know one thing for sure about Bill. Mary's husband did not have an alibi for Monday, July 20th, the day investigators were now sure Mary must have ingested the colchicine that would later kill her. When Bill was interviewed by investigators, he conceded that him being home alone all day on July 20th with no alibi did make him look suspicious, but it was the truth, and he swore he had nothing to do with his wife's death. He then told police that if she really had been poisoned on the 20th, then there were dozens of people who could have administered the toxin, because on work days, dozens of people, clients, friends, colleagues, workers, would all pass in and out of Family Chiropractic, and so they would all have had access to Mary. When detectives asked Bill why he had turned his phone off and put it in the other room on the night Mary was in the hospital, Bill said he never slept with his phone nearby. It was just habit. And when he left the hospital, the doctors had told him that Mary was going to be okay, so he was not on heightened alert. And as for why he had not picked up all of the calls placed to the landline phone at their home that night, Bill said there was no landline extension in his room, so he just didn't hear the phone ringing in the other rooms, and so he never woke up to it. As for his decision to have Mary's body cremated, despite the autopsy report being inconclusive, Bill said cremation was what Mary had wanted, and the medical examiner had released her body, and Bill was told they had all the tissue and blood samples they needed for further testing. Bill also freely admitted to his relationship with his sister-in-law Kathleen, but told detectives that he and Kathleen had never been involved either romantically or sexually before Mary died. And as for Bill's relationship with his wife, Bill never wavered on his description of their marriage as being strong and getting even stronger. They were in the process of planning a month-long vacation together, and after that they were looking forward to retirement together. And according to Bill, the only reason he had even been drawn to Kathleen in the first place was because of his crippling grief over his wife's death. As for being motivated to harm his wife for her money, Bill said that was absurd. He had an inheritance that he had gotten from his father, and he knew that as soon as they sold their medical practice, he and Mary would both get to live very comfortably for the rest of their retirement. But even as Detective Van Namey began following up on all of the things that Bill had said during his interview, the investigation into Mary's death took a sudden and completely unexpected turn. On November 26th, roughly 4 months after Mary's death, Both the Oneida County Sheriff's Department and the Office of the Medical Examiner received copies of a shocking letter. A letter that would instantly put a new name at the top of Detective Van Namie's list of possible suspects. A name, to that point, that no one had considered. Spread across 2 typewritten pages, the letter gave chilling details of how someone had intentionally killed Mary. And midway through the description of motive, method, and the crushing grief that the killer felt after committing the murder, the killer revealed their identity. It was Mary's own son, Adam Yoder. When Detective Van Namie finished reading this letter, he carefully slipped it into a clear plastic evidence bag. Then he took off the gloves he'd used to handle the letter and sat back in his chair. He told his deputies to get the letter over to the forensics lab and test for fingerprints and DNA. Any and everything that would help them confirm the identity of the writer and the authenticity of the letter. After tasking his forensic team, Detective Van Namie began digging into Adam's background, and it didn't take long to uncover some troubling information. Back in July 2014, a year before his mother died, Adam had been accused of rape. The charge was later dropped at the victim's request, and legally it had no bearing or place in the current investigation, but if it was true, the event that was described in the victim's statement painted the picture of someone who was definitely capable of violence and brutality. It also described a person who was jealous and needy and who struck out at people close to him. There were other red flags in Adam's background as well. There was Adam's checkered employment history. There was a civil lawsuit filed by one of his landlords that sued Adam for significant damages to an apartment Adam rented. There was Adam's intense on-again, off-again relationship with Katie. There were reports that Adam suffered from depression and anxiety. And there was Adam's financial dependence on his parents. And even though Adam did have an alibi for July 20th, the day that Mary was poisoned, it didn't actually mean that Adam could not have committed the crime. Police already knew that starting on July 15th, Adam had been in Long Island visiting his sister Liana, and he had only left Long Island at about 8 p.m. on the night of July 21st after getting the news from his father that his mother was sick and in the hospital. But according to the confession in the letter that the police received, Adam had put the colchicine into the nutritional supplements that his mother took like clockwork every day, meaning it didn't matter if Adam was not physically near his mother on the 20th. He could have put the poison into one of her many supplement powders before he left for Long Island on the 15th, and then it was just a matter of time before she actually consumed it. Finally, in December, after a meeting with all the investigators involved in the Mary Yoder case, Detective Van Namie was ready. He picked up the phone and he dialed Adam's number. Shortly after receiving the request from Detective Van Namie to come into the station for a formal interview, Adam left his apartment in Frankfort, New York, and made the 30-minute drive north to the Oneida County Sheriff's Department. At about 10:30 a.m., Adam made his way inside the brick building that housed the Sheriff's Department, where he was immediately escorted to an interrogation room. Adam did not look good. He shifted in his chair, his hand drifting to the pocket in his pants where he kept his pack of cigarettes. He'd lost weight and he seemed pale and nervous. When Detective Van Namie had called Adam earlier that morning and asked him to come to the station, he didn't mention the letter police had received 12 days earlier with Adam's confession in it. The detective had told him this interview was just routine, that earlier that week the police had also taken formal in-person statements from Adam's 2 sisters. And now that Adam was sitting nervously right in front of Detective Van Namie, the detective decided that instead of just confronting Adam with the information in the letter, he'd start by repeating the routine questions that investigators had asked him informally earlier in the investigation. Questions about Adam's alibi, Adam's last recent contacts with his mother, and when Adam had last been inside of family chiropractic care. As Adam appeared to relax a little bit and answered these questions the same way he had before, Detective Van Namie decided it was time to start throwing in some specific information from the letter, like the whereabouts of the poison that had been used to kill Mary. And so after Adam had answered the last of the easy questions, Detective Van Namey leaned forward and asked Adam if he would give police permission to, right now, go outside and search under the front passenger seat of his Jeep Wrangler. Instantly, Adam's whole demeanor changed. He stiffened and looked up sharply at Detective Van Namey. Then, breaking the tense silence, Adam said he really needed to speak to a lawyer. Detective Van Namey offered to get one of the court's public defenders on the phone, and a little while later, detectives left the room, so Adam's phone conversation with the attorney was private. A few minutes later, Adam hung up the phone, and the police officers came back into the interrogation room. Adam sat slouched in his chair, his elbows on the table and his head in his hands. Then, as if coming to a very hard decision, Adam reached out slowly and pulled the search and seizure agreement on the table towards him, and he signed his name. By mid-afternoon, Adam was standing in an empty parking lot outside of the Oneida County Sheriff's Department jail, watching as gloved police officers opened the front passenger side of his 1991 black Jeep Wrangler. Nervous, Adam pulled out his pack of cigarettes and lighter. He stuck one cigarette into the corner of his mouth, he lit it, and he started to smoke. A few minutes later, one of the officers who was conducting the search suddenly stepped back out of the Jeep. In his hand was now a cardboard sleeve, and nestled inside of that sleeve was a brown glass bottle, along with a crumpled up piece of paper. The glass bottle contained the deadly toxin colchicine, and the crumpled up paper was a receipt for the colchicine. The bottle of toxin had been ordered online from a company called Art Chemical by a customer named Adam Yoder, who had told them he needed the toxin to conduct a scientific experiment. However, as much as this evidence seemed to very clearly put an end to the mystery of who killed Mary Yoder, it would turn out this discovery in Adam's car was only the beginning of a much bigger and more twisted story. It would take investigators another 6 months, but they would finally uncover all the details. Here is a reconstruction of how and why Mary Yoder was murdered. Back on December 22, 2014, roughly 7 months before Mary's death, her killer walked into a New York supermarket and used cash to buy a prepaid credit card worth $150. 9 days after that, Mary's killer used that prepaid MasterCard to pay for 1 gram of the deadly toxin colchicine that they had just ordered online from a company called Art Chemicals. The killer also made sure to use a fake email account when they checked out. Because colchicine is a lethal and therefore regulated substance, Art Chemicals required a letter of intent from the purchaser that stated how the toxin was going to be used. The killer had already prepared that letter, typed on Family Chiropractic Care letterhead, saying that the poison would be used in a series of plant experiments. At the bottom of the letter were 2 signatures, Adam Yoder and Mary Yoder. 2.5 months later, on February 6, 2015, the package containing the colchicine arrived at the bustling office of Family Chiropractic Care. Like every other delivery, Katie just got up and signed for it, and then without opening it, she set it down with the other packages near the front desk. And then later that day, Mary's killer would secretly grab that package and smuggle it out of the store without anyone noticing. 5 months later, on Monday, July 20th, Mary's killer slipped into the back office of Family Chiropractic Care, where Mary kept and sold nutritional supplements. After making sure no one else was back there, the killer pulled the brown glass bottle of colchicine from their coat pocket. The killer had done plenty of research, Googling website after website that described in detail the effects of colchicine and the tiny margin that existed between lethal and non-lethal doses. 1 gram was more than enough to poison dozens of people, so Mary's killer had to measure out the exact amount, enough to cause death even if Mary sought medical treatment right away, but not enough that Mary would die immediately. Mary's killer wanted Mary's death to take a few days. This way, it would seem like Mary had died of a gastrointestinal virus or infection. The killer also knew that once they administered a lethal dose of colchicine, there was no turning back. Mary's death would be a foregone conclusion. Because colchicine is a poison that spreads very quickly throughout the bloodstream. As soon as the toxin comes in contact with a human cell, it damages the cell so profoundly that the body's response is to order that damaged cell to self-destruct, meaning what would appear to Mary and her family and doctors as vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal cramps was really the slow and horribly painful process of Mary's tissues committing suicide. Mary's killer carefully measured out an amount of colchicine that was equal to several dozen individual grains of sugar. Then the killer added them to the ingredients Mary would use to make her lunchtime protein shake. The killer then carefully closed the brown bottle and slipped it back into their coat pocket, and then seconds later, they were gone. A few hours later, it was time for lunch. Mary stepped into the back office, and even though she'd had a busy morning, she still had plenty of energy. She glanced at her watch, 12:30 p.m. At least her last morning appointment had ended on time, which meant she could still make the short trip out to Utica and visit her 92-year-old mother. Still thinking ahead to the rest of the day, Mary quickly moved toward the small refrigerator and pulled out the carton of almond milk and set it on the counter next to her open container of protein powder. She looked inside the can and saw there was just about one serving left. After mixing together the powder and almond milk in the blender, Mary turned on the blender and waited until the mixture was thick and frothy. A few minutes later, Mary tipped the last swallow of the protein shake into her mouth. Before leaving the office, Mary washed out the empty glass and the blender jar and called out to Katie that she'd be back in the office by 1:30 at the latest. By the time Mary left the office to go visit her mom in Utica, she was already dead. She just didn't know it yet. Sitting by herself on the couch in the living room after she had shooed her husband Bill to their bedroom upstairs, she had no way of knowing that there was no European vacation ahead for her. No retirement and no more warm summer days spent in her garden. The only thing in Mary's future now was 48 hours of intense physical and emotional suffering followed by death. Mary would have one brief period the next day in the hospital when pain and anti-nausea medication along with replacement fluids would blunt the symptoms of her body's internal collapse. But by the time Mary's husband had fallen asleep peacefully at their home on the evening of July 21st, Mary's organs had already begun to shut down. And by the time her children and husband had gathered at the hospital on July 22nd, Mary's heart would only have enough strength to keep beating long enough for Mary to say goodbye to her husband and her children. Meanwhile, as Mary slipped into cardiac arrest at 2:54 p.m. on the afternoon of July 22nd, Mary's killer sat by themselves in the quiet, empty office at Family Chiropractic Care. Caitlin Conley, affectionately known for years to Bill and Mary Yoder as Katie, their trusted family friend, their office manager, and their son's longtime girlfriend, stared at the screen on her cell phone. She was waiting eagerly for news from the hospital, and with a thrill of dark satisfaction, Katie imagined the grief and pain that Adam must be feeling as he watched his mother die. It would turn out Adam and Katie didn't just have an on-again, off-again relationship. They had an incredibly toxic and abusive relationship. And when Adam had finally broken up with Katie for good back in August of 2014 after Katie had accused him of raping her, Katie had snapped. There had been plenty of other times over the course of their 4-year-long relationship where she had manipulated Adam into getting back together with her after they'd broken up. A faked pregnancy and miscarriage, taking him to court over a loan she had made to him that he had not paid back, the threat she might commit suicide. But after that charge of rape that she had filed against Adam back in July of 2014, she knew deep down that even if they did get back together, it wouldn't be for long. Katie had withdrawn the charge, but Adam had been shocked and deeply shaken by what he said was a totally false allegation. And so by August 2014, Adam had decided that the only way to protect himself was to stay away from Katie Conley. But Katie couldn't let that happen, at least not without making Adam suffer first. So, beginning back in early 2015, shortly after their official breakup, Katie started laying her plan for revenge. She would take from Adam the thing he loved the most, the person who was always there when he needed help, his mother, Mary Yoder. and Katie would be so clever about how she planned this murder that instead of anyone suspecting her, she would make it look like Adam was the killer. She had set up a fake email account under his name and used it to buy the colchicine. She had also paid for the poison with a prepaid card she'd registered in Adam's name, and she'd signed Adam's name to that letter of intent that was sent to the colchicine distributor, Art Chemicals, saying how the poison was going to be used in a science experiment. As for conducting the actual murder, that was too easy. Katie just signed for the toxin at work, and no one noticed because she signed for all the packages. Then she took it home with her for safekeeping until July 20th, at which point she just walked into the back office, and when no one was looking, she pulled it out and she spiked Mary's protein shake ingredients. And then, following Mary's death, Katie would plant the bottle containing the toxin under the front seat of Adam's car, and then in the anonymous letter that Katie would write and send to police, she would not only tell them to look in Adam's car for the toxin, but she would also tell them that Adam was the killer, that he had confessed to her about killing his mother because apparently his mom had not been giving him the attention he needed and deserved, that he felt like she had abandoned him, and so he had snapped. But in reality, when Detective Van Namey got that letter, he didn't believe what it said. It just seemed too convenient, like whoever had written it and sent it in was probably just trying to frame Adam. And so right after getting this letter, Detective Van Namey had turned to Katie to learn more about Adam to see who might want to frame him. And not only did Katie seem to go out of her way to paint Adam in a very negative light, she also confessed that she was the one who wrote the letter. She insisted that Adam had admitted his guilt to her, and so she had written the letter because she was afraid that if Adam didn't get arrested right away, he might hurt her, Katie, like he had hurt her when he tried to rape her. When Adam arrived at the police station for that interview on December 8th, 2015, it just didn't make any sense to investigators that if Adam was the murderer, why would he agree to a search of his car that he knew would turn up that bottle of colchicine? And when they tested that bottle for DNA and fingerprints, the only match they got was for Katie, not Adam. On June 13th, 2016, Caitlin Conley was arrested and charged with planning and carrying out the murder of Mary Yoder. If she was convicted, she would have faced life in prison. But on May 18th, 2017, after a jury could not reach a unanimous verdict, the judge declared a mistrial. It wouldn't be until the end of a second trial in January of 2018 for the lesser charge of manslaughter, which is committing an unintentional killing, that Katie would be found guilty and sentenced to 23 years in prison. At around 9 p.m. on October 26, 2009, a 19-year-old college student named Miyako Hiroka bagged up the last bit of trash inside of the ice cream parlor where she worked, and she dumped it into a bag and she tied that bag up. It was closing time, and so Miyako looked around the inside of the parlor, made sure everything was where it was supposed to be, and then she flipped off the lights, threw her purse over her shoulder, she grabbed that bag of trash, she headed outside the parlor, she shut and locked the door, she dumped the trash in a nearby bin, and then began walking towards the exit of the mall, which is where this parlor was located. It was inside of this big mall. Miyako went to school in a city called Hamada City, which is located on the coast of Japan in an area called the Shimane Prefecture. And Hamada City was a totally beautiful and very remote location with these amazing beaches and unbelievable mountains with all these ski resorts on it. I mean, this was an incredible place to live. But as much as Miyako did love living there, she was actually far more excited about where she'd be living the next year because she was doing an exchange program. She'd be studying in Russia, and that was so exciting for her. And in fact, this exchange program was the reason why Miyako had picked up this job at this ice cream parlor, because she came from a family that was not poor by any means, but they didn't have a lot of extra income, and Miyako felt strongly that she really wanted to pay her way to go do this big Russian exchange program because it wasn't cheap, and so she was picking up as many shifts as she could to save up money to pay her way. And so Miyako eventually reached the exit of this mall, and she stepped outside into the night, and then she had a decision she needed to make. And she needed to make this decision every night after work. There were two ways that she could get back to her dorm, which was located about a mile away. The quick way would be to just hop on a bus and have the bus take her to her dorm, but that cost money. And remember, Miyako is trying to save up as much money as she can to pay for Russia next year. And so taking the bus just felt like, not really worth it. And the other option, which was free, was much longer and frankly just plain spooky. And Miyako hated it. What it entailed was basically just walking to her dorm, but it would mean walking for about a third of a mile through this really spooky forest that looked like it was straight out of a horror movie. Now, up until recently, Miyako's coworker had always left with her at the same time, and they lived roughly in the same area, and so they would walk together through that forest, saving money, and also, providing each other security as they went through the spooky area. But recently, the coworker had quit, and so now Miyako was all alone. And so as Miyako stood there wondering what she should do, take the bus route or take the forest route, she just thought about, next year, it's all going to be worth it. I'm going to go to Russia. I'm going to pay my way. It's going to be awesome. And after all, what's the worst that can happen? It's just a few minutes walking through a forest. I've done dozens of times. Before long, I'll be in my brightly lit, safe dorm room studying away, and everything will be fine. And so Miyako turned and began walking towards the forest. The following day, a little past 4 p.m., the owner of the ice cream shop where Miyako worked was standing inside the parlor feeling really annoyed because Miyako had not shown up for her shift, and now the owner, who normally did a lot of administrative and managerial things, was stuck at the counter serving all the customers, basically doing Miyako's job. But when 5 p.m. came and still Miyako had not shown up, and the owner had tried calling her and she didn't pick up, and there was just no sign of her, the owner went from being annoyed to being somewhat worried. And so after again not being able to call Miyako to figure out what was going on, he wound up going through her file and finding her mother's phone number, and he called her. And when he spoke to Miyako's mother, he knew right away there was something wrong. Because Miyako's mother actually was pretty panicked, and she said, you know what? Last night when Miyako was coming home from work, she told me she would call me when she got to her dorm, but I never heard from her, and I haven't been able to get in touch with her since. And so after this conversation ended, Miyako's mother would call the police and report her daughter missing. And pretty much instantly, the police in Hamada City responded in force. They launched a huge investigation to go figure out what happened to Miyako. And really the reason behind that is because Hamada City is this unbelievable place, this secluded, safe place where things like this did not happen. And frankly, it scared everybody, and they wanted to deal with it as quickly as possible. And so what police did at first is they went and looked at security footage from the ice cream parlor where they knew she had been working on the night she went missing. And sure enough, at about 9:16 p.m., there's footage of her walking out of the ice cream parlor in the mall. She's got a purse over her shoulder and, she shuts and locks the door. She throws the trash away, and then she heads towards the exit. But after that, nobody saw her. There was no more footage. There was no more tips or anything. She just vanished once she left the mall. And so very quickly, this story gained lots of attention because, again, Hamada City is like this quintessential vacation spot. It's so perfect. It's so safe. And to have this girl just go missing, it was scandalous. And so it made the news all over Hamada City. And also people who lived in Hamada City were suddenly on edge at night. What's out there snatching people up? In fact, Miyako's college, during the few days following her disappearance, they set a curfew for all their students. Like, all their students had to be back in their dorms at a certain time to keep them safe. But again, despite the police really leaning into this case from the jump and putting all their manpower and all their resources into this, they really had no idea what happened to Miyako. Then, on November 6th, 2009, so 11 days after Miyako went missing, a man who was hunting for mushrooms up on this mountainside about 15 miles away from the ice cream parlor believed he spotted this beautiful mushroom sitting underneath a few fallen leaves. And so excited, the guy runs over and he begins moving away the leaves to grab this big meaty mushroom. But as soon as he grabbed the skin of this mushroom and began to pull, he stopped. And then he quickly turned and began sprinting back down the path that had brought him up here. And as he was running, he pulled his phone out and he saw he had no service, and he just kept on running and holding the phone up looking for service. And then finally, when he was about halfway down the mountain, he saw he had service in his phone and he called the police. And the second the dispatcher answered, this man began screaming, "I found a human head!" When police arrived on that mountainside where this man claimed to have found a human head, well, they confirmed he was right. They found Miyako's severed head right underneath those leaves. And the reason this guy thought her head was a mushroom, a dark-colored mushroom, because it was obvious that Miyako's face had been so badly beaten and it was all black and blue before she lost her head. And so this mushroom hunter had literally thought that was a big, big mushroom. And so at this point, the Hamada City Police shifted their area of search from around the mall and the ice cream parlor where they thought they would find Miyako to this forested mountain area where her head was found. And now, of course, it was no longer a search and rescue. It was a recovery mission. They're just looking for the rest of Miyako's body. And over the next couple of days, as police searched this forested mountainside, they would find different parts of Miyako all over the place. And then after they had found, all the pieces to Miyako, the running theory based on what they were seeing is that very likely she had been strangled to death and then her body was burned and then she was dismembered and scattered throughout this forested mountain area. But there was very little evidence about who had actually done this to Miyako. Miyako had no enemies to speak of. Everybody who spoke about Miyako said she was incredibly lovely and kind, and really there wasn't anybody in her life that would want to do her harm. And also because Miyako's body had been destroyed and left out for so long, any trace evidence left behind by her killer or killers was basically non-existent. And so the police really had no leads to speak of. They had no suspects or anything. And so they called in psychologists to try to make, a profile of who they thought might have done this. And the best theory anyone could come up with was that this had been a random crime of opportunity, that the person who killed her didn't know her, and that likely her killer was a man who was likely between the ages of 20 and 40. But even that information really didn't narrow anything down, and so quickly, this case began to go cold. But as the police investigation itself began to go cold, the kind of lore around this story was only growing. I mean, this really seemed like a totally unbelievable case, considering where it happened. I mean, Hamada City is like this perfect place. How could this happen here? And so what started as being kind of a local news story, albeit a big local news story, became a major national story all over Japan. And so all these TV outlets and journalists were descending on Hamada City, and they were taking video of the ice cream parlor and of the police department and filming, Miyako's dorm and her school and her parents' house. I mean, there were people all over the place trying to get any bit of information to report on about this case. And despite there being dozens and dozens of these live reports basically every day coming out of Hamada City about this case and about Miyako, there was one particular news report that took this case from being, totally unfortunate and sad and tragic and horrible to completely unbelievable and bizarre. Shortly after Miyako's remains had basically all been found, but they were still doing some recovery operations up on that mountainside, one of these kind of random TV reporters who was in Hamada City to report on this crazy case decided to set up their TV camera so it was pointing towards the dark entrance of that spooky forest that Miyako would walk through to get back to her dorm. And so this TV news reporter's got their microphone and, they're standing with the forest entrance right behind them, and the cameraman's filming, looking towards this opening of the forest. And the actual report was pretty generic. I mean, this reporter was basically saying, well, coming at you live from Hamada City, just outside of the forest where perhaps Miyako was killed. And it was just like that. It was just kind of talking about the case, and there was nothing to it. At least not to the TV reporter and the cameraman who were on site. Because for them, the entire report was pretty routine. They did their job, they got their shot, they got their report, and then they left. But they streamed it live. So while they were doing it, all these people are tuned in watching this news report live in front of this forest. And something really unsettling happened on this broadcast. While that news reporter was talking, another voice began to be heard by people watching this broadcast. And it was not the cameraman, and it was certainly not the TV journalist. It was a woman's voice. And there was no woman anywhere near the shot. And after the fact, the journalist and the cameraman would also attest that there was nobody around. It was just them. But this detached, very pained voice said very clearly, and all these people heard it live, "This is very painful. Why only me?" And so after this news report happened, this story, this case about Miyako, went from being just a Japanese story to being like an international sensation. because everybody believed when they saw this video that that voice that was heard was Miyako's ghost, basically talking on camera. That's why you can't see her. It's her spirit communicating with the living world. However, despite that drawing even more attention to this case, it didn't remotely help the police actually solve the case. They still had no idea who did this. And that's how this case would stay for years, just totally stalled. That is, until 7 years later, when a police officer was conducting a routine police review of old criminal case files that hadn't been solved, going through them all to see if maybe evidence had been missed, and maybe that was why the case had not been solved. And so this police officer is looking through all these case files, and when they landed on the Miyako case, they did discover a piece of evidence that had been totally overlooked. It was the file of a convicted sex offender named Yoshiharu Yano. Yoshiharu was a 33-year-old man who had served time in prison for assaults on 3 different women in Tokyo, which is 500 miles away from Yamada City, where Miyako was killed. And because of that 500-mile gap between Tokyo and Yamada City, Yoshiharu had been completely overlooked in terms of being a suspect in Miyako's murder. It just seemed like he was too far away to be involved. But the police officer who was doing that routine review, they discovered that right before Miyako was murdered, this Yoshiharu guy had been let out of prison and decided to live in Hamada City. And on the night Miyako was killed, when she decided to walk into that forest, well, they found security footage of Yoshiharu's car driving along around that forest and up near that mountain where Miyako's remains were all discovered. And so this investigator who discovered this piece of information got permission from higher-ups to search Yoshiharu's home where he was living right then. And when they searched his home, they discovered a digital camera with 40 photos on it that would explain what happened to Miyako. It was very clear Yoshiharu had murdered Miyako because some of the pictures contain photos of Miyako and they are just horrible. But figuring out who Miyako's killer was not the end of this case. In fact, it wasn't even the most shocking part of this case. The most shocking part of this case is what happened to Miyako's killer, Yoshiharu, basically right after she was murdered, and that voice, that detached female voice, was heard on that TV news report. 7 years earlier, right around the time that Miyako's head had been found, and also after that voice had been heard on the TV newscast, some people who were driving in a car north of Hamada City began calling the police to report something very strange. They called the police and said, there is this small white Toyota Corolla car that has 2 people inside of it, and they've driven to the side of the road, and the driver is ramming over and over again against the railing. Like they're smashing into the railing, backing up, smashing over and over again, like the car is somehow in control. They don't understand how these people are not getting out of the car. Like, what are they doing? Traffic had stopped on either side. It was just totally nonsensical. And then by the time the police showed up, this car that was just repeatedly driving into the side of this guardrail, it burst into flames with the 2 people inside still clearly alive and looking terrified, and they caught on fire and died. Now, at the time, this did make the news. It looked very much like some sort of weird murder-suicide where the driver had intentionally, driven the car until it burst into flames and killed themselves and also their passenger. But it didn't really amount to more than just a really weird news story because there was no connection to the Miyako case. This is like a totally isolated thing. However, 7 years later, when that police officer discovered the link that Yoshiharu was in Hamada City, and then they figured out, yep, Yoshiharu was the killer, well, suddenly, that totally weird murder-suicide took on a whole new meaning. Because the driver of that car was Yoshiharu, and the passenger was his mother. And again, from eyewitness testimony, it didn't really make sense the way this all happened. It was almost like the car was possessed or something, that, the passengers couldn't control it. Now, who knows if that's true, but when you combine it with the sound of that female voice on the TV news camera that everybody assumed was Miyako's ghost saying, "This is so painful, why only me?" suddenly those words took on a new meaning. People thought, you know what it is? Miyako's ghost must have taken control of that car and made sure not only Yoshiharu suffered and died, but his family member died as well, that she was seeking her revenge on her killer. The next and final story of today's episode is called Mother Knows Best. In the early evening of January 23, 1897, a blacksmith named Erasmus Shue stoked his fire inside of his little shop in rural West Virginia and then called out to his 11-year-old helper who was in the back cleaning up. Erasmus had been planning to head home early that night. However, a last-minute order for horseshoes had just come in, and so Erasmus knew that was not going to happen. He was going to have to work late. And so he was calling for his helper to send the helper to his home, Erasmus's home, to check on Erasmus's wife, Zona. He wanted to make sure that 1, Zona knew he would be late, and 2, if Zona needed anything, the helper could go out and get it for her or help around the house or whatever she needed. After the helper had left, Erasmus went back to poking at his fire, but his mind was not on the horseshoes he needed to make. Instead, it was on his wife, Zona. The couple hadn't told anyone yet, but Zona was pregnant. Erasmus and Zona had only just met a couple of months earlier, but they had fallen in love very quickly. Zona was 23 years old, and she had beautiful dark hair and dark eyes and a quick sense of humor. She was a total free spirit who had grown up on a farm, and she had never really been away from home. When Erasmus had arrived in the little village called Livesey's Mill, which was located near a river at the foot of this mountain and was right near where Zona lived, he and Zona had noticed each other right away. Erasmus, who was quite a bit older than Zona, he was 35 years old, was tall and handsome with piercing blue eyes, and he had come to this little rural town to set up his blacksmith shop. And to Zona, he was like this amazing, new, exciting thing. Zona's family, especially her mother, Mary Jane, did not approve of the fact that Zona and Erasmus had begun seeing each other, mostly because Mary Jane didn't like the fact that Erasmus was so much older than Zona, but Zona was known for being incredibly stubborn, and she loved Erasmus, and so there was just no stopping her. So, in November, just a couple of months after meeting each other, Zona and Erasmus got married and they moved into a little house together, and very quickly, Zona got pregnant. And both she and Erasmus were so excited about this that they wanted to go around and tell people, but early on, it was clear Zona had some complications with this pregnancy. She was sick all the time, and she just seemed really unwell, and the doctor who was seeing her knew that it likely had to do with her pregnancy. And so the couple decided that they should just wait and let the pregnancy develop a bit before announcing the news. So, on this late January day, Erasmus began hustling to finish these horseshoes because he really wanted to get home and be there for Zona and make sure she really was okay. And so as Erasmus thought about Zona, the steel he was heating inside of this fire was glowing bright orange and was ready to be forged into shape. And so Erasmus got his hammer and he got to work. Meanwhile, Erasmus's 11-year-old helper had arrived at Erasmus and Zona's house, and the helper walked through the gate up to the front door of this little 2-story home, and he knocked on the front door. But Zona did not come to the door, which the helper thought was odd, because Zona was someone who was always bustling around the home and was very quick to open the door and chat with neighbors. And now, standing in front of this door, the helper couldn't even hear a sound inside of the house. It was like no one was home. And so the helper knocked again, and after some more silence, he just reached down and tried the doorknob and found it was unlocked, and so he swung the door in. And right away, the helper noticed that the house was totally dark. None of the lamps were lit, even though the sun was setting fast. And so the helper stepped inside of the house and continued to call out for Mrs. Shue, but there was no answer. And at some point, as the helper turned a corner and looked towards the base of the stairs that led up to the second level, he froze, because lying on the ground was Zona. She was lying perpendicular to how the stairs run, on her back with one arm over her chest, like she was sleeping at the foot of the stairs. And so at this point, the helper is scared. He doesn't know what's going on here. Obviously something is wrong. And so very slowly, the helper began moving closer and closer to Zona. And when he was practically right on top of her, he yelled out her name one more time. And when she didn't call back and her chest wasn't moving and she was just totally still, he knew obviously something was terribly wrong. And so the helper at this point turned around and sprinted out of the house and ran back to his own house. And when he got there, he ran inside and he told his mother that he thought Mrs. Shu, Zona, was dead. And so the mother told the helper, run back to the blacksmith shop and tell Erasmus to go home right now. I'll get the doctor. It would take the local doctor, the same one who had been treating Zona for her pregnancy complications, almost an hour to finally get to Zona's house. And when the doctor arrived, he found the 11-year-old helper and his mother and other neighbors kind of clustered around in the first floor of the home. And then when he went up to the second floor into the master bedroom, he found Erasmus, who by this point had returned, and he was sitting on his bed, and he had laid out his wife, Zona, so that she was on her back and her head was in his arms, and he was stroking her hair and rocking back and forth and crying. The doctor, of course, knew Zona and Erasmus very well because of how often he had been treating Zona for her pregnancy issues over these last few weeks, and so he felt a pit of sadness looking at this scene, but he knew he had to do his job, and so he gently walked over and he put his hand on Erasmus's shoulder, and he just said, I need to examine Zona's body. And Erasmus, at this point, he didn't even look up. He just continued to sob and rock back and forth while stroking her hair. Finally, the doctor kind of was a bit more forceful in asking Erasmus to step aside, at which point Erasmus did. He got out of the way and positioned Zona flat on the bed, and he made sure her hair was perfectly combed all around her neck. And then Erasmus knelt down right next to the bed and continued stroking his wife's hair and crying, while the doctor at this point kind of moved to the foot of the bed and began looking at Zona and beginning his examination. And the doctor would quickly confirm that yes, Zona was dead. And after looking at her pelvis and kind of moving her around, the doctor came to the conclusion that very likely Zona had passed away from pregnancy complications. Zona's funeral would be held the next day at the local cemetery at the top of this hilltop. And by this point, the word had gotten out that Zona had been pregnant when she died. And so during this funeral, everybody was staring at Erasmus, who was overcome with grief and crying so hard that he could barely catch his breath. And then right before they lowered Zona's casket into the ground, Erasmus made a point of putting his wife's favorite scarf into the coffin with her. He said his final goodbyes, he shut the casket, and then it was lowered into the ground. But while the mourners were obviously very moved by just how unbelievably grief-stricken Erasmus was, his whole family was wiped out in one blow, what really stood out to the people that attended that funeral was not Erasmus's reaction to his wife's death, but rather Zona's mother's reaction to Erasmus. During this funeral, Mary Jane, Zona's mother, didn't seem sad or grief-stricken or in any way reacting to the fact that her daughter had died. Instead, as the funeral went on, Mary Jane shamelessly glared at Erasmus with a look of pure hate and disgust on her face. And then, after the funeral was over, all the mourners wanted to go up to Mary Jane and Erasmus to pay their final respects to the family, but Mary Jane ignored all these people and promptly left the funeral without saying a word to anyone. And in the days that followed Zona's funeral, Mary Jane's behavior only continued to get more and more bizarre. When neighbors would drop by Mary Jane's house to drop off food or just check in on her, Mary Jane refused to come to the door. Mary Jane basically began staying up all night. People would see there were candles lit in her bedroom at all hours, and they'd see her pacing around her room and then periodically kneeling on the ground and kind of staring off into the distance. And then on the rare occasion that Mary Jane actually left her house, she would look totally disheveled and distracted, and as she walked around town, she'd be mumbling under her breath and constantly looking over her shoulder like she was scared someone was following her. And when concerned neighbors came up to Mary when she was out of her house, she refused to make eye contact with them, didn't want to talk to them, and as fast as she could would get away from them. Whatever was going on with Mary Jane, her husband was not willing to talk about it to other people in town. However, they did notice that he had begun sleeping in the barn, so he was not even staying in the house with his wife. And then, on the morning of February 21st, so about a month after Zona had died, Mary Jane walked out of her house looking totally clean-cut. She was not disheveled. She was not looking over her shoulder. She wasn't muttering to herself. She was standing tall, moving with a purpose, looking totally coherent. And as she moved, the only emotion people could see on her face was anger. And so Mary Jane, angrily, walking with a purpose, walked her way to the local prosecutor's office, and instead of knocking and waiting to be let inside, she just opened the door and barged right inside. The prosecutor knew Mary Jane and knew how strange she had been acting over these last few weeks, and so when she came inside, he was alarmed at her sudden presence, but he was also pretty curious as to what was going on. And so when she came in and demanded to speak to him, he was happy to go into his office and take a meeting kind of simply out of curiosity. But once the two of them sat down in his office, Mary Jane proceeded to tell this prosecutor this totally outlandish story about her dead daughter, Zona, that at first made the prosecutor think, okay, clearly Mary Jane has lost her mind. That's what's been going on over the past few weeks. All this grief of losing her daughter has caused her to kind of snap. But by the end of these 2 hours that Mary Jane seemed to just be kind of rambling about this story about her daughter, the prosecutor started to realize that what she was saying kind of made a lot of sense, and his suspicions began to rise and rise. And so once Mary Jane was done telling this wild story about Zona, the prosecutor was convinced that what Mary Jane was saying had to be true, and so he knew they needed to dig Zona up. And so after Mary Jane had left, the prosecutor ran to the local doctor's house, the same doctor who had been treating Zona and then also looked at her after she died. And the prosecutor would tell the doctor that, hey, we need to exhume Zona and you need to examine her again. And the doctor at first was like, wait a minute, what's going on here? But then after hearing what the prosecutor had to say about this crazy story that Mary Jane had just told him, the doctor agreed that, okay, yeah, we do need to do this. And so the next day, February 22nd, a team of men with shovels, along with the prosecutor and the doctor, headed up to the hilltop cemetery where Zona was buried, and they dug her casket up, and then they carried the casket down to the local schoolhouse, and then once she was inside, the workers lifted her body, which was fairly well preserved because the ground was so cold. They lifted her body out and they placed it on a table, and then everybody left except for the doctor and the prosecutor. And once the room was clear, the doctor and the prosecutor began examining Zona all over again. And within about 30 seconds of this re-examination of Zona's body, basically at the exact same time, the doctor and the prosecutor, who were on either sides of the body, saw the thing that Mary Jane had alluded to in her wild story about her daughter. And so the doctor and the prosecutor, they're seeing this thing, they look up at each other and they can't believe it. Mary Jane's story had to be true. The following is Mary Jane's wild story. On the day of Zona's funeral, even though Mary Jane was overcome with grief over losing her daughter, the feeling that she really was harboring was hatred towards Erasmus. She hated Erasmus, she had always hated him, but now it was like her daughter is dead and she's forced to watch this guy sob and cry over her daughter's casket, when in her mind she's like, this funeral is about her, it's not about you. And so the whole funeral, she's just staring at Erasmus, channeling all of her energy towards hating him. But then, as she's doing this, a new emotion began to creep up on her that she couldn't quite describe. Basically, it felt like something was terribly wrong. And intuitively, Mary Jane felt like the only person who could explain what this thing was that was wrong kind of in her life somewhere was her daughter, Zona, who was obviously dead. And so this feeling that something is terribly wrong, it completely consumed Mary Jane's mind. And so by the end of the funeral, she wasn't mad at Erasmus. She was just thinking, how do I get in touch with my daughter? I need to get answers from my daughter. And so when the funeral ended, Mary Jane just left the funeral as fast as she could. She went home, she went into her bedroom, and she knelt down and she began to pray. Not for peace or strength in this difficult time, but instead, she prayed for her daughter's ghost to appear to her and tell her what was wrong. And for the next month, that is all Mary Jane did. She was obsessed with this idea that she needed to basically conjure her daughter's ghost to tell her what this thing was that was wrong. And so that was why she was acting totally crazy, all she did was pray and then look for signs that her daughter's ghost had come or was on her way. And so she'd be up all night kind of looking around, hoping her daughter would suddenly appear. And then when she would go outside, the reason she was muttering is because she was still praying under her breath. And she was always looking over her shoulders because she thought her daughter would appear any moment. And then, finally, one night in the middle of February, so this is a month into Mary Jane's attempts to conjure her daughter's ghost, she was in her room, she was praying like she normally did with all of her candles lit, and all of a sudden, as she's kneeling down praying, this bright light appears in the middle of her room. And as this light suddenly appeared, the room began to get really cold. And Mary Jane is staring at this light thinking, this is my daughter. But then just as quickly as the light and the cold that came with it had appeared, it disappeared. And so Mary Jane was both really excited because she felt like, okay, the prayers are working. That had to be my daughter's ghost or some sign that my daughter's ghost is going to come here. And so Mary Jane just doubled down on her prayers. She knew she was close to getting her daughter to show up. And so over the next 2 days, that bright light would appear 2 more times, and each time it would just quickly disappear. But again, Mary Jane is thinking, okay, something's happening, my prayers are working. And then finally, on the 4th night, as Mary Jane is in her bedroom praying, the light appears in the middle of her room, it starts to get cold, but then instead of the light disappearing, Mary Jane would describe seeing her daughter kind of step out of this light and suddenly appear in the room. Mary Jane said that her daughter was dressed all in black and her skin was very pale and her eyes were these dark pits and her hair was straight down right over her shoulders and she was staring at her mother. And Mary Jane, when she saw this, even though she had been trying for a month to get her daughter's ghost to appear, now that it seemed to be happening, she was terrified. And so Mary Jane began backing up right as this ghost begins walking towards Mary Jane. But then Mary Jane, as she's up against the wall, tells herself, you have to be strong. You need to talk to the ghost. You need to figure out what's wrong. And the only question that Mary Jane was able to come up with was, how did you die? And when she asked this question, Zona's ghost came to a stop. And then when Zona opened her mouth, dirt poured out. And then with a raspy, low voice, she began to tell her mother a story. She told her that Erasmus appeared to be this wonderful person to the community, but behind closed doors, he was a monster. He hit her and screamed at her over the littlest things, and then on the night of January 22nd, so one day before Zona would be discovered at the base of the stairs by Erasmus's helper, Zona's ghost would tell Mary Jane that Erasmus had become enraged at Zona over the food she had made that night for dinner. He had wanted meat, and she had made something else, and so he was furious. And when Zona tried to tell Erasmus that she would make more food, or there was other food for him to eat, to just please calm down, Erasmus stood up and he grabbed Zona by the neck and he lifted her off the ground. And right at this moment in this story that Zona's ghost is telling Mary Jane, the ghost would stop speaking. And this look of abject terror would come across the ghost's face, as if she was suddenly reliving this moment that happened with Erasmus. And as she's standing there with this horrible look on her face, the ghost began to levitate off the ground, and then it opened its mouth. And as it did, no sound came out, but instead, it was like all the air in the room was getting sucked into this ghost's open mouth. And then all of a sudden, there was this loud cracking sound as the ghost's head suddenly violently whipped around 180 degrees, but the ghost's body was still facing towards Mary Jane. And after this happened, Mary Jane is sitting there totally dumbstruck, and the ghost suddenly drops back down onto the ground, still with their chest facing Mary Jane, but their face pointing behind them. And then Zona's ghost turned around and began walking out of the room, and because she had turned her body around, that meant her head, which was facing the wrong way, was now oriented towards Mary Jane again, and Mary Jane would say the ghost was smiling. And then right before Zona's ghost left, she would say to her mother, "Now do you see what he did to me?" And then Zona just vanished and the room became warm again, and Mary Jane, who was suddenly feeling so exhausted, just sat down on the bed and wept. Mary Jane had, the next morning, promptly gotten up and rushed to the prosecutor's office and told him the story of seeing her daughter's ghost and how the ghost had told her that Erasmus had throttled her and that was what killed her. Now, the prosecutor was really moved by Mary Jane's story, but it was when he rushed to the doctor to ask about re-examining Zona's body to see if she had marks on her neck from where she could have been throttled. That was when the doctor actually told the prosecutor that when he did the examination of Zona's body on the day she was found, he would say that Erasmus spent the entire examination at the head of the bed, cradling Zona's head and brushing her hair, but now that he was thinking about it, he could have been covering up her neck with the hair. And then also they thought about the funeral when, right before Zona was lowered into the ground, Erasmus placed a scarf claiming it was his wife's favorite around her neck when she was buried. Again, perhaps trying to conceal the fact that there were marks on her neck. And when they did exhume Zona's body and they removed that scarf that Erasmus had placed, they would see there were marks all over her neck that looked like fingerprints. And then upon further examination, they would see that her neck was actually dislocated and that her windpipe had been crushed. Erasmus would be arrested for the murder of his wife just minutes after the doctor and prosecutor, basically at the same time, saw the marks on Zona's neck during their re-examination. During Erasmus's trial, Mary Jane would take the stand and she would tell the story of her daughter's ghost coming to her and explaining that Erasmus had killed her. And the testimony was so compelling that the jury found Erasmus guilty, even though there was no motive. Basically, they convicted him on the strength of Mary Jane's ghost story. Erasmus would be sentenced to life in prison, but he would die just 3 years after being incarcerated from a mystery illness that passed through the prison. It would also turn out that Erasmus had been married 2 times before marrying Zona. One of his wives had divorced him for being abusive. The other wife died in a freak accident when she was helping Erasmus fix their chimney when all of a sudden a brick fell loose and hit her in the head. Today, there is a plaque right near the cemetery in West Virginia where Zona was buried that reads in part, "Only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer."